Now, with the tabling of the progressive wage white paper, the attention now shifts to the possible implications. One of the positive points, according to Bait-Al-Amanah's Benedict Weerasena, is a voluntary aspect, which grants flexibility to employers. He shares his take on the newly presented policy.
This definitely lessens the unintended consequence if the progressive wage policy is imposed on all the companies instead, because we know that imposition of higher wages by law is a tool for bad economic consequences. Wages should always be an outcome of negotiation, not an imposition. And the incentives provided here will definitely nudge positive changes in industrial policy. I think one thing very important that the minister also highlighted was that the wage increments will be linked to workers' productivity and skills. In other words, workers are expected to translate the training into increased productivity, thus justifying the higher pay. I think this is like a win-win situation for both employers and employees. However, that being said, in terms of the mechanism, there need to be a clear and objective, equitable metrics to measure productivity objectively, and also considering that it's diverse sectors covered, it cannot be a one-size-fits-all approach, but it needs to be sector or industry dependent. Another thing that I would like to applaud the minister for the progressive wage policy is that it will be carried out in phases. The minister that explained that there's a pilot program in June with 1,000 companies first, an initial focus on SMEs, and also that the maximum wage limit will undergo annual revisions. I think that is a really good phased approach instead of a direct, straight away covering all approach. And because it's a phased approach, we can actually let the market dynamics determine the adoption and participation.
Benedict also shares his concerns on whether the policy can be sustainable in the future.
I think the first thing is to consider the incentives provided by the government. Is it sustainable in the long run? I understand that it's about 2 billion that will be provided in the first phase. Yeah. And so, in other words, can the government sustain this incentive program in the long run, especially if there's oversubscription to the program? In the long term, can they phase out this subscription until it becomes a culture? This progressive wage policy becomes a culture instead, and it's not dependent on government incentives. Because at the end of the day, it will deplete the government resources in the long run. Second of all, I think in terms of implementation, is to ensure that it translates into tangible productivity growth, and it doesn't become a handicap instead. This program should not become a handicap, in other words, where businesses subscribe to it just because they feel they can benefit from the incentives without real tangible productivity growth. I think that's where the mechanism is extremely important to ensure there are no leakages and that the incentives really does translate into tangible productivity growth for the businesses and for the country as a whole.